O Seminário Ciência, Espiritualidade e Saúde reuniu o especialista Koenig, entre outros palestrantes, para debater a relação da religião com a medicina. Com a coordenação do Dr. Fernando Lucchesi, o evento começou com uma oração interreligiosa, com a participação de autoridades de diferentes crenças.
Em 1880, um médico austríaco chamado Luiz Felipe Semmelweis percebeu que se ele lavasse as mãos entre as necrópsias dos que haviam morrido durante a noite e os partos do dia, nem as crianças nem as mães morriam do que ele chamava febre puerperal. Era a infecção que ele estava transmitindo com as próprias mãos. Ele não se conhecia a bactéria nessa época. Então, era um mistério que estava acontecendo e Luiz Felipe Semmelweis interrompeu esse mistério com atos simples como lavar as mãos. Depois veio a bactéria, pastéria, etc. Atualmente, resultados positivos ou negativos de procedimentos e tratamentos médicos sofrem influência de inúmeros fatores. Maior ou menor espiritualidade é um deles. Tal como o Semmelweis, não sabemos ainda qual é o vetor dessa ação, o que provoca essa ação, como ela é transmitida. Mas certamente ela existe. E talvez nos próximos anos a cortina do mistério seja erguida. Hoje nós estamos aqui para avaliar algumas das informações sobre esse novo território: ciência, espiritualidade e saúde. A oração influi no resultado do tratamento médico? O que acontece com o paciente quando o médico reza com ele? A solidariedade e generosidade prolongam a vida saudável? A autoestima afeta a saúde? O pessimismo faz mal para a saúde? Essas são algumas das indagações que serão respondidas hoje aqui. Em maio de 2003, ao visitar minha filha, na época estudante da Duke University, nos Estados Unidos, frequentei a biblioteca da universidade. Minha filha estava sempre estudando, sempre com provas, e fiquei impactado com a quantidade de livros e artigos publicados por um neuropsiquiatra, Dr. Koenig. Telefonei para ele. Ele me convidou para ir à sua casa no sábado, onde passei horas agradáveis descobrindo o admirável mundo novo da espiritualidade e da saúde. Desde então, começamos a construir o dia de hoje, desde 2003.
I think it's very important to people, to patients, but within the medical profession and the healthcare area, which is so focused on the science and not so much on the religion or the spirituality, it has really pushed the religion and spirituality aside. And so what we are talking about here today is to bring it back in. Bring it back in along with the powerful medications and technologies that we have, as well as bringing the spirit along with that, alongside of it. Not one without the other, but both. First of all, there's religion, and that is what I'm going to be talking a lot about. So I'd like to explain what this term means. The supernatural, or God, in Western religious traditions, or to ultimate truth, reality, or enlightenment in the Eastern traditions. It may also involve beliefs about spirits, angels, or demons. Religions usually have specific beliefs about the life after death and rules to guide behaviors within a social group. Religion is often organized and practiced within a community, but it can also be practiced alone and in private outside of an institution. So I'm using a broad definition of religion that does not just involve institutional religion, but also includes private religious practices and beliefs and religious commitments. Central to its definition is that religion is rooted in an established tradition that arises out of a group of people with common beliefs and practices concerning the transcendent. The transcendent. Religion is a unique construct whose definition is generally agreed upon. Next, there is secular humanism. Secular humanism is a way of viewing human experiences and behavior that does not involve religion, does not involve God, the transcendent, a higher power, or ultimate truth. It involves none of those. The focus is on the rational self as the ultimate source of power and meaning. The rational self. This definition is generally agreed upon and is clear and does not overlap with other constructs. Now, spirituality is the word that there is the most non-agreement on. People can't agree on what this really is, and in particular, how to measure it. Today, spirituality is considered personal, something that individuals really define for themselves. It is often free of rules, regulations, and responsibilities that are associated with religion. One can be spiritual but not religious. Now, this term spirituality is especially useful in clinical settings. In clinical settings, when doctors or healthcare professionals are talking to patients about these issues, about their beliefs and their practices. So the word spirituality is wonderful because it's so vague and nebulous. However, because it's so vague and nebulous, it really is difficult to measure and quantify. So because of that problem with spirituality, what I'm going to do is really kind of focus on religion, okay? Because religion is something you can measure. The spiritual parts are just too hard to really quantify. And if you're trying to look at relationships with your health and your well-being, you've got to have something to measure to begin with to see if it's related to the health. First of all, I'll talk a little bit about coping with stress. Really, this is one of the core roles that religion can play in people's lives. It helps them to cope with stress, with medical illness, with loss, with bad things that happen in our lives, things that are out of our control. Religion is very powerful in helping people to cope with these kinds of things. So religion is, really it helps people deal with these issues, including the stress of medical and health problems. Now here's a little study that we did at Duke, and we asked patients, it's a very simple study, we gave patients on the general medicine and cardiology services at Duke University, we gave them a scale from 0 to 10. And we asked them, to what extent do you use religion to help you to cope? To what extent do you use your religious beliefs to help you to cope with your medical illness? What we found was that 40% of consecutive admissions to the hospital, 40% of those patients indicated that religion was the most important factor that kept them going. That in dealing with their medical problems, that there was nothing more important than prayer, their relationship with God, their church family, reading religious scriptures, that there was nothing more important than this connection with God and helping them make sense and meaning of their illness and help them to keep going rather than to simply quit and give up. Only about 1 in 10 patients said that they used religion a small amount or not at all. Only 1 in 10. Now, after September 11th, when the terrorists flew the planes into the World Trade Center in New York City, Americans were terrified at what this meant and what was happening. So there was a survey within 1 week of the terrorist attacks that asked, how did Americans cope with these stresses? They found that 90%, 9 out of 10 Americans coped using religion. Turn to religion, turn to prayer, turn to God, turn to their church or their mosque or their synagogue. Does religion really help people to cope better? People say that it helps them, but does it really? This is something that we can study. We can study, we can measure religious coping, and we can see whether or not those who are doing more of that have better health. So that's what I'm going to show you now. This research is a systematic review of published, data-based, quantitative studies around the world. It's a systematic review, which means that every study that was published and was reviewed by other scientists, that was approved and published in the science journals, every study is included in this review, regardless of what the finding was whether it was positive, whether it was negative, and in particular, the finding had to be statistically significant. Statistically significant, okay? Now, all of this research is published in 2 books. The first book is the Handbook of Religion and Health by Oxford University Press. That was published in 2001. The second book is the Handbook of Religion and Health, the same book, but a new edition that was just published a few months ago. Now, since the year 2000, in the next 10 years, from 2000 to 2010, there were actually 2,000 more studies that were published, which means that the research has more than tripled within just the last 10 years compared to the over 100 years prior to the year 2000. So I'm going to summarize the results of the second handbook here. I'm going to go quickly over these results because I don't have a lot of time, but I want to summarize it for all of you so you kind of will understand how much research has really been published and has looked at these relationships between religious or spiritual involvement, and for right now we're going to look at mental health. So first of all, we'll look at the emotional disorders: depression, suicide, substance abuse. And the positive emotions like happiness and well-being. We'll look at meaning and purpose and hope. We'll look at forgiveness and altruism and gratitude and compassion. These are all positive aspects of mental health, and we're going to want to know, how is religion related to these? Also, we'll look at social health. We'll see whether or not religious involvement is related to the health of a person's social environment, the health of their families, their marital relationships, and also the health of a community, which is called social capital. Social capital is kind of the health, broadly speaking, of a community. Let's look at relationships with religious involvement. Again, I will go quickly. With regard to depression, sadness, depression, there have been 444 scientific studies, separate studies that measured religious involvement and measured depression. Of those 444 studies, 61% find that religious people experience less depression. If they become depressed, they recover more quickly from depression. And religious interventions are shown to reduce depression compared to other treatments. In 6% of these studies, researchers find that religion is related to more depression. And this tends to be in studies that look at people who are experiencing difficulties in their family, difficulties in their marriage, or difficulties with children. Because religious people, for them, family is very important. And if there are problems going on in the family, then if they're more religious, then that's going to bother them more. So that's kind of what these findings that show that depression is more common among those who are religious. We diagnosed depression in 87 patients, and we followed them over time, over 1 year. And we found that those who were more deeply religious were recovering more quickly from depression over a year. So we divided them into these 3 groups. And those who were low on this intrinsic religiosity, or kind of the depth of their religious involvement, to what extent their religious beliefs were very important to them and on which they based their life and their decisions in their life. So those people who had that kind of religious belief, they recovered more quickly from their depression. Here is looking at suicide. There have been actually 141 studies looking at this relationship between religion and suicide. Of those, 75%, 3 out of 4, studies find that the religious people are just less likely to commit suicide. One reason is because they have more meaning in their life, more purpose in life. Next is substance abuse. I know that here in Brazil there are issues, as there are in the United States, with young people using drugs and using alcohol excessively. This is a terrible thing to happen because this interferes with the youth and their ability to get their education and to raise their families, and then ultimately to get work and be able to pay money into the Social Security system so that people can be cared for. So in studies that have measured religious involvement, in particular of youth, you can see that there have been 278 studies that have been done. Of those 278, 86% find that religious people use less alcohol, significantly less, statistically significantly less alcohol. Also with regard to drug abuse, again, there have been 185 separate studies, of which 84% report that the youth don't use drugs as much if they have a religious background, if they have religion in the home in particular. Next are the positive emotions, well-being, happiness. Those experiences that we all crave for, that we all do, whatever we do in our life, many of us are just seeking to be happy and seeking to be full and to have a life that is full and happy. There have been 326 separate studies that have looked at relationships. They have found that 80% report that religious people are simply happier. Everything else being considered, religious people have fuller lives. They have more life satisfaction. They're more satisfied with their lives. Now, there have been a few studies finding that religious people are less satisfied. But actually, of the 326 studies, only 2 studies have reported that the religious people have lower well-being or lower happiness. The vast majority, over 80 times more studies, have shown that it's related to greater well-being. This is a study of older adults that we did. You can see that with increasing church attendance, that's in the blue, increasing church attendance, increasing well-being and happiness. Here is intrinsic religiosity in the red. There, you see, if you have low intrinsic religiosity, low well-being, and then high intrinsic religiosity, high well-being. What about other things? Meaning and purpose. Look at this. 45 studies have examined this. 93% find that religious people have greater meaning and purpose in life. Here's looking at hope. 40 studies have been done. 29 finding greater hope. And then optimism, looking at things in an optimistic way. 80% reporting that. What about forgiveness? Again, 85% of studies show that religious people are more able and more willing to forgive. They do things for other people. They're more altruistic. They volunteer more. And as far as gratitude, compassion, and kindness, we can actually measure those. There are scales to quantify the amounts of these things. Of those studies looking at religious involvement, again, all of them, this is all of the research studies in the world literature, in the scientific literature, they all find that the religious person has more gratitude, compassion, and kindness. A little bit about social health. Social capital is the health of a community. That is measured by how much trust is there in a community. How many people in a community volunteer to serve on various committees, volunteer in the government, volunteer in all sorts of different ways. What is the percentage of students that graduate from high school? What is the amount of teenage pregnancy? What is the, how much crime is there in the community? That's what's called social capital, the health of a community. You can see that studies that have examined social capital find that communities that have more churches, more synagogues, more mosques, where there's more religious involvement, that the community is healthier. The whole community is healthier and thriving more, and there's less crime and less drug use. Marital stability. We're talking about less divorce, greater satisfaction within marriage, and less abuse of one's spouse. 86%, 68 of 79 studies find these relationships. Now bear in mind, these are all scientific studies published in journals, in science journals, and they're quantitative. This is not about somebody telling a story or something. This is measurement. This is science. And these studies are published in journals, science journals, that have been antagonistic against religion. You know, science has not been very positive towards religion. Science has tried to get rid of religion. But even though science would be biased against religion, still these studies are appearing in the science journals themselves. That's what's so remarkable about this.